The morning began like every other in the quiet suburban neighborhood, where trimmed hedges, polished driveways, and cheerful greetings concealed lives far more complicated than they appeared. Birds sang from telephone wires, sprinklers clicked across emerald lawns, and curtains opened to reveal familiar routines. Behind one of those curtains stood 23-year-old Lena, her gaze fixed not on the peaceful street outside but on her own reflection in the kitchen window. To anyone passing by, she seemed to have everything a young wife could want: a comfortable home, a hard-working husband, and a future waiting patiently ahead. Yet the silence inside those walls carried a weight that no visitor could ever notice. Lena moved through her mornings with practiced precision. She brewed coffee, folded laundry, watered the small row of flowers beneath the living room window, and smiled whenever neighbors happened to wave. Every movement resembled a performance rehearsed too many times. The smile disappeared the moment she turned away, replaced by a distant expression that had become painfully familiar. Loneliness had settled into her life so gradually that she could no longer remember when companionship had been replaced by routine. Her husband, Daniel, left for work before sunrise most mornings. He rarely forgot to kiss her forehead before walking out the door, yet the gesture felt automatic, almost mechanical. Their conversations had become brief exchanges about groceries, bills, or weekend plans that never materialized. Neither argued. Neither confessed disappointment. They simply drifted through each day as though silence had become another piece of furniture in the house. "You'll be all right today?" Daniel asked while fastening his watch. "I'm always all right," Lena answered with a faint smile. He nodded, accepting the reply without hesitation. "Don't wait up tonight. It'll be another late shift." "I won't." The front door closed softly behind him, leaving the house wrapped in an almost uncomfortable stillness. Hours stretched endlessly. Lena wandered from room to room searching for something that might occupy her thoughts. She tried reading, abandoned the book after several pages, switched on the television, then muted it moments later. Even the ticking clock seemed louder than usual. She often wondered whether loneliness made ordinary sounds sharper or simply made people notice them more. From her kitchen window, she occasionally noticed the elderly man living across the fence. Harold had occupied the neighboring house for years after losing his wife, though they had exchanged little more than polite greetings. At 71, he moved carefully but carried himself with quiet dignity. Most afternoons he sat on his weathered porch, watching children ride bicycles, neighbors mow their lawns, and the neighborhood settle into its predictable rhythm. Some considered him reserved. Others believed he simply enjoyed observing life unfold from a comfortable distance. Late one afternoon, Lena accidentally dropped a small watering can while tending her flowers. The metal clattered loudly against the stone path. "You all right over there?" Harold called gently from his porch. She looked up, slightly embarrassed. "Yes, just clumsy today." He chuckled warmly. "Happens to the best of us." His voice carried no judgment, only kindness. For reasons she couldn't explain, the brief exchange lingered in her thoughts long after she returned inside. As evening approached, golden sunlight faded behind rows of rooftops, painting long shadows across the fences separating one family from another. Daniel still hadn't returned. Lena prepared dinner anyway, leaving one untouched plate across from her own before quietly placing both meals into the refrigerator. Darkness settled over the neighborhood, replacing laughter with silence. Lights blinked off one house at a time until only scattered windows glowed against the night. Lena stood by the back door, hesitating as though listening for something only she could hear. Then, pulling her light sweater tightly around her shoulders, she slipped into the cool evening air. Without speaking to anyone, she crossed the yard, opened the small gate between the properties, and disappeared toward Harold's softly illuminated back door, unaware that one seemingly innocent decision had already begun changing everything. Lena hesitated only briefly before knocking. The porch light cast a warm circle across Harold's doorstep, softening the deep lines on his face when he opened the door. He seemed neither surprised nor overly pleased to see her, only welcoming in a quiet, unhurried way that immediately eased the nervousness she had carried across the yard. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." she said. Not at all, Harold replied, stepping aside. Evenings are quieter than I'd like. Please come in. His home smelled faintly of old books and fresh tea. Framed photographs rested on shelves, though most showed landscapes instead of people. They spoke for less than an hour about ordinary things. The neighborhood, gardening, the changing weather, and the challenges of keeping roses alive through summer. Nothing about the conversation seemed inappropriate. Yet when Lena returned home, the silence inside her own house felt heavier than before, as though she had accidentally discovered what genuine attention sounded like. Days slipped into weeks, and those evening conversations gradually became part of an unspoken routine. Sometimes Harold invited her for tea on the porch. Other afternoons they talked over the backyard fence while she watered flowers and he trimmed hedges with careful hands. He listened without interrupting, remembered details she had mentioned days earlier, and asked questions that suggested he truly cared about the answers. You seem happier when you're outside, Harold observed one afternoon. I suppose I am. And inside? Lena looked toward her kitchen window before answering. Inside feels quieter. He nodded thoughtfully, offering no advice, only understanding. Somehow that made his words more comforting than any reassurance could have. Daniel noticed subtle changes but struggled to explain them. Lena hummed while washing dishes. She smiled at messages before quickly locking her phone. She no longer seemed impatient when he worked late, almost as though she had found another way to fill the empty hours. You've been going out more, Daniel remarked during dinner. Just errands. Every evening? The grocery store never stocks everything at once. He accepted the explanation with a distracted shrug, though the answer lingered in his thoughts longer than he admitted. The lies remained small enough to seem harmless. A forgotten receipt disappeared into the trash before Daniel returned home. A phone call ended abruptly whenever footsteps approached. Shopping bags occasionally contained little more than bread or milk, despite hours spent away from the house. Each deception appeared insignificant by itself, yet together they quietly reshaped the foundation of the marriage. Harold never encouraged dishonesty directly. Instead, he filled conversations with stories about missed opportunities, lonely years after losing his wife, and the importance of being understood before time ran out. Lena found herself sharing feelings she had never spoken aloud, even to Daniel. She laughed more easily around Harold, then felt guilty every time she crossed back through the gate separating their homes. One afternoon, Harold handed her a worn novel. My wife loved this, he said softly. Perhaps you will too. I'll bring it back when I'm finished. There's no hurry. His fingers briefly brushed hers as she accepted the book. The touch lasted only a moment, almost accidental, but neither acknowledged it. Not everyone remained unaware. Across the street, Mrs. Porter, a widow known for tending her immaculate garden, often noticed more than people realized. While trimming her hedges each morning, she observed Lena's increasingly frequent visits to Harold's property. Sometimes Lena arrived carrying a pie or flowers. Other times she stayed until dusk before quietly returning home. Mrs. Porter frowned but said nothing. She reminded herself that loneliness could create unusual friendships, especially between neighbors. Even so, an uneasy feeling settled in her mind whenever she watched Lena disappear through Harold's gate. She chose silence over gossip, believing it was none of her business. As autumn edged closer, the conversations deepened, the visits lengthened, and invisible boundaries quietly shifted, carrying both of them toward truths neither fully understood nor seemed prepared to face. As the leaves turned shades of amber and gold, Lena's visits to Harold no longer felt unusual to her. They had become woven into the rhythm of her days, as natural as her morning coffee or evening walks through the garden. What had started as harmless conversations across a backyard fence now occupied the quiet spaces of her thoughts. Every discussion left her feeling lighter, yet every return home carried a growing sense of guilt she struggled to ignore. The neighborhood continued to regard Harold with quiet respect. Children waved when passing his porch, delivery drivers greeted him by name, and longtime residents often paused for brief conversations about the weather or local events. He had lived on the same street for decades, becoming one of those familiar figures whose presence seemed permanent. To most people, he was simply the polite widower who kept his lawn neat and never missed the annual neighborhood charity fundraiser. Yet beneath that carefully maintained image rested pieces of a life few people fully understood. Through scattered conversations rather than deliberate confessions, Lena began discovering fragments of Harold's past. He occasionally mentioned a younger brother with whom he had not spoken in many years. Once, while staring thoughtfully into his untouched cup of tea, he referred to a daughter who had chosen to live overseas after a painful disagreement. He never explained what caused the separation, only saying that some words could never be taken back once spoken. Families don't always heal the way people expect, he said quietly. What happened? Lena asked. Harold offered a faint smile instead of an answer. Sometimes the silence afterward hurts more than the argument itself. Moments like those fascinated Lena. Rather than making Harold seem mysterious in a dangerous way, they made him appear deeply human. His regrets felt genuine, his loneliness familiar. She found herself wanting to understand the chapters of his life that remained unwritten, believing that hidden pain often revealed a person's true character. Old photographs occasionally appeared during their conversations. Most showed vacations, gardens, or faded holiday gatherings. Faces had begun disappearing from later pictures until only Harold remained. Lena noticed the gradual absence but never asked why. She sensed there were stories he preferred to leave unfinished. Without realizing it, she began measuring every conversation with Daniel against those she shared with Harold. Her husband still cared for her in practical ways. He repaired broken shelves, remembered to buy groceries, and worked long hours to provide a comfortable home. Yet practical kindness no longer satisfied the emotional emptiness growing inside her. Harold listened. He noticed changes in her mood before she spoke. He remembered details Daniel often overlooked. I don't even have to explain myself to you, Lena admitted one evening. Perhaps because I've had more years to learn how important listening can be, Harold replied. She smiled. I wish someone else understood that. Harold said nothing. His silence encouraged her to continue speaking, revealing thoughts she had buried for months. Each confession deepened the trust between them while quietly weakening the bond she shared with her husband. Daniel noticed the change without understanding its cause. Lena seemed physically present yet emotionally somewhere beyond his reach. Their conversations ended quickly, her attention drifting toward her phone whenever it vibrated. She no longer asked about his day with genuine curiosity, nor did she complain when he stayed late at work. The arguments he expected never came, replaced instead by unsettling indifference. One evening, Daniel watched her smile at a notification before locking the screen. Everything okay? He asked. Just a message from a friend. What friend? She hesitated only briefly. Someone from the gardening club. Daniel frowned slightly. I didn't know you joined one. It isn't anything serious. Although the explanation sounded reasonable, something about it felt incomplete. He searched her expression for reassurance but found only polite distance. That night, long after Daniel had fallen asleep, Lena sat alone beneath the soft glow of the hallway light, reading another thoughtful message from Harold. It contained nothing openly romantic, only a reminder to care for herself and not let loneliness convince her she was invisible. The words warmed her heart in ways she no longer wished to question. Hearing Daniel stir upstairs, she quickly erased the conversation, slipped the phone into her pocket, and deleted every remaining message before quietly opening the front door and stepping inside, unaware that each secret she buried was becoming harder to keep hidden. Deleting the messages gave Lena a brief sense of relief, but the comfort vanished almost as quickly as it arrived. Secrets demanded constant attention. Every smile had to be explained, every absence justified, every careless glance disguised before it attracted suspicion. Yet instead of pulling away, she found herself moving even closer to Harold. The invisible line they had once respected quietly disappeared, replaced by a relationship neither of them dared define aloud, though both understood exactly what it had become. Their meetings shifted from casual conversations on the porch to long afternoons inside Harold's house, where the curtains softened the afternoon light and the outside world seemed far away. They shared meals, listened to old records, and talked about dreams that had never become reality. Lena no longer visited simply because she was lonely. She came because being with Harold had become the only time she truly felt noticed. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled beyond the windows, Harold reached across the table and gently took her hand. "You don't have to pretend here," he said. Lena looked down at their hands but did not pull away. "I don't know who I'm pretending to be anymore. You've spent too long living for everyone else's expectations." His thumb lightly brushed across her fingers. "And what if I don't know how to stop? You already have." The silence that followed carried more meaning than any confession. When Harold leaned forward and kissed her, Lena closed her eyes instead of resisting. It lasted only a moment, but afterward nothing between them could honestly be called friendship. She left the house shaken, guilty, and strangely hopeful all at once. The affair remained carefully hidden, yet it gradually reshaped every decision Lena made. She adjusted grocery trips to match Harold's schedule. She ignored invitations from neighbors and stopped answering calls from the few friends she still kept in touch with. Birthdays, coffee dates, and weekend outings suddenly seemed exhausting compared with the quiet certainty she found across the fence. Harold rarely gave direct instructions. Instead, he planted thoughts that slowly took root. "People often hold us back without realizing it," he remarked one evening. "What do you mean?" "They become comfortable with who they've decided we are. The moment we change, they become uncomfortable." Lena nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes I think nobody really sees me. I see you." Those 3 words echoed in her mind long after she returned home. As the weeks passed, Harold became increasingly protective of their relationship. Whenever Lena mentioned spending time with anyone else, his expression subtly changed before returning to its usual calm. "Your neighbor invited me for lunch tomorrow," Lena said one afternoon. "Mrs. Porter?" "Yes." He smiled politely. "She's pleasant enough, but people enjoy asking questions. They don't always deserve the answers." "I suppose you're right. There are very few people who truly care about your happiness." He paused before adding quietly, "Don't confuse curiosity with concern." Without realizing it, Lena began declining invitations before considering them. Her world gradually shrank until nearly every meaningful conversation involved Harold alone. She convinced herself the distance from others was her own choice, never questioning how naturally his opinions had become her own. Meanwhile, Daniel's uncertainty hardened into quiet suspicion. He avoided dramatic confrontations, choosing observation instead. He noted the evenings Lena claimed to be shopping despite returning with only a handful of items. He wrote down unusual phone calls, unexplained errands, and the growing number of nights she seemed emotionally absent even while sitting beside him. One evening he discovered a receipt from a cafe several miles away, dated during hours Lena insisted she had been buying groceries nearby. He folded it carefully and placed it inside a small notebook already containing dates, times, and scattered observations. "I'm probably imagining things," he whispered to himself. Still, he kept writing. His notebook remained hidden inside the bottom drawer of his desk, growing thicker with every passing week. He wasn't searching for proof of betrayal as much as searching for an explanation that would make sense of the woman who no longer felt like the wife he had married. Across the fence, Harold watched Lena leave after another secret evening together. His smile lingered as she disappeared into the darkness, while inside her own home Daniel quietly added another entry to his notebook, unaware that the inconsistencies he was collecting were leading all 3 of them toward a future none of them could escape. Daniel's notebook remained hidden, but the questions inside it could no longer stay confined to paper. Every unexplained absence, every hurried excuse, and every distant expression had slowly eroded the patience he once believed was endless. He still hoped there was an innocent explanation, yet each passing day made that hope more difficult to protect. The quiet uncertainty that had filled their home finally gave way to open conflict. It began over something ordinary. Lena arrived home nearly 2 hours later than expected, carrying a single grocery bag containing bread, milk, and fruit. Daniel stood in the kitchen, pretending to wash dishes, though he had been watching the clock for nearly an hour. "You're late," he said calmly. The store was crowded, For 2 hours? There was traffic. You said you walked. Lena froze for an instant before setting the groceries on the counter. I forgot. I stopped somewhere first. Where? She sighed heavily. Why does everything have to be an interrogation? Because nothing you say matches what actually happens. His voice remained steady, but the disappointment behind it struck harder than anger ever could. I'm trying to understand what's happening. Nothing is happening. Then why does it feel like I've already lost you? Lena turned away, refusing to meet his eyes. You're imagining problems because you're never here. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. I'm working for us. No, she replied quietly. You're working. That's all. The words settled between them like shattered glass. Neither spoke again that evening. They ate separately, slept facing opposite walls, and woke carrying the same silence into another day. The arguments became more frequent after that. Small disagreements about schedules or household chores quickly transformed into accusations and defensive denials. Daniel repeatedly asked whether someone else had entered her life. Lena rejected every suggestion with convincing confidence, insisting he was becoming paranoid. You don't trust me anymore, she said during one confrontation. I want to. Then stop treating me like a suspect. I would if you'd stop giving me reasons. She walked away before he could say anything else. Outside the house, however, someone else noticed changes that extended beyond ordinary marital tension. Maya, one of Lena's oldest friends from college, happened to meet her at a neighborhood cafe after several weeks without contact. They had once shared nearly everything, but recently Lena had canceled plans again and again. You look exhausted, Maya observed after they sat down. I'm just tired. No, Maya answered gently. You're somewhere else. Lena forced a smile. I'm fine. You've said that 3 times in 5 minutes. For a moment, Lena's confident expression cracked. Her hands trembled slightly as she stirred untouched coffee. If something's wrong, you can tell me. There isn't anything to tell. You don't have to carry everything alone. Lena quickly stood before the conversation could continue. I should go. Maya watched her leave with growing concern. The woman walking away no longer resembled the cheerful friend she remembered. There was anxiety in every hurried step, as though Lena feared standing still long enough for someone to see through her carefully constructed composure. Later that evening, Lena described the unexpected meeting to Harold. Maya thinks something's wrong. And what do you think? I don't know anymore. Harold remained silent before speaking carefully. People become uncomfortable when they realize they're losing influence over someone. She's only worried. Is she worried about you? Or about the version of you she's always known? Lena frowned thoughtfully. I hadn't considered that. They'll all say they're trying to help. Harold continued softly. Your husband, your friends, your neighbors. Sometimes control hides behind concern. His words settled deeply within her, making every future conversation with others seem suspicious before it even began. That night, after Daniel had gone to bed without saying goodnight, Lena quietly opened the closet. She removed a small canvas travel bag and carefully folded several changes of clothes inside. She added toiletries, a phone charger, and the novel Harold had once given her. When she finished, she slid the bag beneath the bed, hidden from sight, telling herself it was only a precaution, though somewhere inside she already knew she was preparing for a decision that would change everything. The small canvas bag remained hidden beneath the bed for 3 days, untouched but never forgotten. Every time Lena opened the closet, her eyes drifted toward it, reminding her that one impulsive decision could erase the life she had built. Daniel noticed her growing distraction but mistook it for exhaustion. Neither realized they were standing at the edge of a night that would permanently alter every memory attached to their quiet neighborhood. The weather changed without warning. Dark clouds gathered throughout the afternoon, swallowing the last traces of sunlight beneath an oppressive gray sky. By evening, heavy rain hammered rooftops while fierce winds bent tree branches toward the streets. Thunder rolled across the neighborhood with enough force to rattle windows and send families indoors. Porch lights glowed through sheets of rain, illuminating empty sidewalks and abandoned gardens. Daniel received an unexpected call from work requiring him to return for an overnight emergency repair. "I have to go," he said while pulling on his jacket. "Tonight? I don't have a choice." He paused at the door. "We'll talk tomorrow. Properly." Lena nodded without answering. Once his car disappeared into the rain, she stood motionless in the hallway. The silence inside the house felt unbearable. After several anxious minutes, she reached beneath the bed, removed the overnight bag, then hesitated. Instead of taking it with her, she pushed it back into place, grabbed only her coat, and slipped through the back gate toward Harold's house. He opened the door almost immediately. "I thought the storm might keep you away," he said. "I needed to see you." Rainwater dripped from her sleeves as she stepped inside. For a while they sat quietly, listening to the wind batter the windows. Harold poured tea while Lena struggled to calm the uneasiness she could not explain. "You seem frightened," he observed. "I feel like everything is falling apart." "It doesn't have to. What if Daniel already knows?" Harold remained thoughtful. Knowing and proving aren't the same thing. His answer unsettled her more than it reassured. Their conversation gradually shifted into another difficult discussion about the future. Harold spoke of starting over somewhere else, free from judgment and constant suspicion. Lena listened, torn between impossible choices. "I can't just disappear," she whispered. "Why not? My whole life is here. Your whole prison is here." She looked away. "I never asked you to leave your husband. You didn't have to." The words hung heavily between them. Outside, the storm intensified. Another voice suddenly cut through the rain. "Lena." She recognized Daniel instantly. He stood near the side gate, soaked by the downpour, staring toward the illuminated living room window. His shift had ended early after the emergency proved less serious than expected. Finding the house empty, he had crossed the yard searching for answers. He pushed through Harold's unlocked gate. "Lena, come outside." Harold stepped onto the covered porch. "This isn't the time." Daniel ignored him. "I wasn't talking to you." Neighbors later recalled hearing raised voices carried between crashes of thunder. Some believed Daniel accused Harold of destroying his marriage. Others insisted Harold remained calm while Lena pleaded for everyone to stop. The storm swallowed many words before they reached nearby homes. Mrs. Porter looked through her curtains but saw only blurred figures moving beneath flashes of lightning. A nearby teenager heard something heavy strike the ground, then a sharp cry that ended almost as quickly as it began. Another neighbor remembered a door slamming. No one could agree on what happened next. By morning, the rain had stopped. Damp leaves covered sidewalks, and broken branches littered front yards. The neighborhood slowly returned to its familiar routine until a scream shattered the quiet. A delivery driver approaching Harold's front porch found him lying motionless beside the garden path. Police officers arrived within minutes. Harold was pronounced dead at the scene. There were no immediate signs explaining exactly how he had died. No obvious weapon rested nearby. The storm had washed away footprints and diluted possible traces of evidence. The yard contained scattered objects displaced by powerful winds, making it impossible to distinguish accident from violence. Detectives quickly learned about the late-night argument. Daniel admitted confronting Harold but insisted he left while both were alive. Lena confirmed visiting Harold yet struggled to describe the sequence of events after emotions overwhelmed everyone. Mrs. Porter reluctantly revealed the unusual visits she had witnessed for weeks. Within hours, the peaceful neighborhood transformed into an active crime scene filled with flashing lights, yellow tape, whispered rumors, and unanswered questions. What had begun as hidden loneliness had ended in sudden death, and as investigators sealed Harold's property and assembled the first pieces of a baffling case, every person connected to him quietly became a potential suspect. By midday, the flashing patrol cars had become the neighborhood's new landmark. Officers moved carefully between Harold's house and the surrounding properties, photographing fences, collecting discarded objects, and speaking quietly into radios. The yellow tape fluttered in the cool breeze where children had played only days before. Behind drawn curtains, residents watched every movement, waiting for answers that refused to arrive. Instead of rushing toward an arrest, detectives focused on rebuilding the final 24 hours of Harold's life one careful detail at a time. Lead Detective Morgan believed assumptions ruined investigations. "We don't solve cases by choosing a suspect," she reminded her team. "We solve them by following facts." Every conversation, phone call, and unexplained absence became part of a growing timeline stretching across the whiteboard inside the temporary command center. Daniel described returning home early from work, discovering Lena missing, and walking next door after noticing Harold's lights still on. "I confronted him," Daniel admitted. "Did you threaten him?" Detective Morgan asked. "I was angry. That's not what I asked." Daniel lowered his eyes. "I said things I regret. Then I left." Lena's interview proved far more fragile. Exhaustion darkened the circles beneath her eyes, and every question seemed to force her deeper into confusion. "When did you last see Harold alive?" Morgan asked. "He was standing on the porch." "What happened after your husband arrived?" "They argued. And then? I don't remember everything." Morgan remained patient. "You don't remember, or you don't want to?" Tears formed before Lena looked away without answering. Investigators requested phone records from all three parties. The reports revealed hundreds of calls and messages exchanged between Lena and Harold over several months. Most conversations occurred while Daniel was working late shifts. Although many messages had been deleted from Lena's phone, forensic specialists recovered fragments from cloud backups and service records, revealing emotional conversations far more intimate than ordinary friendship. One recovered message simply read, "I feel invisible until I'm with you." Another ended with, "Soon we won't have to hide." The discoveries immediately shifted the investigation's direction. Financial records introduced another mystery. Harold had withdrawn several unusually large amounts of cash during the previous 2 months. Bank statements showed multiple transactions, but investigators found no obvious purchases matching the missing money. Meanwhile, Lena's personal account reflected several anonymous cash deposits made shortly after Harold's withdrawals. "No explanation?" Morgan asked. "I never asked where the money came from," Lena whispered. "You accepted it anyway? It wasn't supposed to mean anything." The answer only deepened suspicion. Outside the interview rooms, neighbors began offering wildly different versions of events. Mrs. Porter insisted Daniel seemed furious when entering Harold's yard. Another resident claimed Harold often appeared controlling whenever Lena visited. A teenager believed he heard 2 male voices arguing before a woman's scream interrupted them. Someone else insisted there had been only one shout before silence returned. Each statement contradicted another. Every witness seemed absolutely certain. None could fully agree. Detectives compared timelines repeatedly, discovering small inconsistencies in nearly every account. Storm damage had obscured security cameras, washed away physical evidence, and distorted memories already weakened by darkness and fear. The truth remained buried beneath conflicting recollections and unanswered questions. News of the investigation spread quickly beyond the neighborhood. Local reporters gathered outside police barricades, interviewing residents eager to speculate. Before long, whispers transformed into certainty. The existence of Lena's secret relationship no longer belonged only to investigators. People stared whenever she stepped outside. Conversations stopped as she passed. Former friends avoided eye contact altogether. At the grocery store, 2 strangers quietly exchanged knowing looks before walking away. Mrs. Porter watched from across the street, saddened by how quickly sympathy had turned into judgment. Maya attempted calling several times, but Lena ignored every attempt. The woman who had once smiled easily now kept curtains closed and lights dimmed, hiding from the community that had already decided who she was. Even without formal charges, her reputation collapsed beneath the crushing weight of betrayal, while Detective Morgan quietly noticed one troubling pattern emerging from every interview. Almost everyone described Harold as a lonely old man, yet no one truly seemed to know the man who had died. The image of Harold as a gentle widower began to fracture almost as quickly as it had been built. Detective Morgan refused to let public opinion decide the direction of the case. While reporters focused on Lena's affair, investigators widened their search beyond the neighborhood, tracing Harold's life through old addresses, employment records, and the names of people who had known him long before he settled behind the quiet fence. What they discovered complicated everything. Former co-workers described Harold as intelligent, patient, and remarkably persuasive. He possessed an unusual ability to recognize emotional weakness in others, often becoming the person they depended upon most. Few accused him of outright crimes, yet several remembered friendships ending badly after money disappeared, relationships collapsed, or families became divided. Individually, the stories sounded like misunderstandings. Together, they suggested a troubling pattern stretching across decades. One retired colleague spoke carefully during an interview. He never shouted, the man recalled. That wasn't his way. Harold convinced people they were making their own choices, even when the ideas started with him. Another acquaintance, a woman who had known Harold through a volunteer organization years earlier, hesitated before answering investigators' questions. He always found lonely people, she said quietly. Widows, divorced women, anyone grieving something. He made them feel understood. Did he threaten them? Morgan asked. No. Did he force them? Never. She looked toward the table before continuing. That's what made him dangerous. They believed every decision belonged entirely to them. The interviews continued for days. An estranged cousin described years of emotional pressure surrounding family inheritances. Harold's daughter, contacted overseas, declined returning for the investigation but agreed to speak by video call. She refused to discuss private family disputes in detail, yet one sentence lingered with Detective Morgan. My father always needed someone who depended on him, she said. Once they did, walking away became almost impossible. Meanwhile, forensic specialists uncovered journals inside Harold's study. Most entries contained harmless reflections about gardening, weather, and neighborhood life. Hidden among them, however, were passages describing people in unsettling terms, not by their names but by their emotional needs. She fears abandonment. He mistakes silence for loyalty. Loneliness opens doors honesty never could. The notes revealed no confession to violence, yet they painted a portrait far removed from the harmless retiree remembered by his neighbors. Lena listened in disbelief as Detective Morgan summarized the findings. You're saying none of it was real? I'm saying we don't yet know. He cared about me. Morgan studied her expression carefully. Perhaps he did. Then why are you telling me these things? Because caring about someone and controlling someone aren't always opposites. The words struck harder than any accusation. For the first time since Harold's death, Lena replayed dozens of conversations from a different perspective. She remembered how naturally he had discouraged time with Maya, how often he questioned Daniel's intentions, and how easily she had accepted his explanations without challenge. Advice she once considered comforting suddenly sounded disturbingly calculated. Yet another thought refused to leave her mind. She had still chosen to cross the fence. She had still lied. She had still betrayed her husband. No revelation about Harold erased her own responsibility. Detective Morgan wrestled with the same uncertainty. The investigation no longer resembled a straightforward case involving jealousy or revenge. Instead, it revealed a web of emotional dependence, manipulation, personal choice, and hidden vulnerability. Every new discovery shifted sympathy from one person to another before reversing direction again. Outside the station, television crews debated whether Lena was victim, accomplice, or both. Neighbors who had condemned her days earlier quietly questioned their own assumptions after hearing rumors about Harold's past. Even Daniel found himself struggling to reconcile the elderly man he confronted with the psychological portrait investigators were uncovering. The case grew darker with every interview, not because clear answers emerged, but because certainty itself seemed to disappear. As Lena left the station carrying questions she could no longer silence, Detective Morgan received an unexpected message from the forensic laboratory. New evidence recovered from Harold's clothing had finally arrived, and it promised to challenge every version of the fatal night told so far. The laboratory report arrived just as Detective Morgan's questions were becoming more difficult to answer than the evidence itself. The new findings did not identify a killer, but they confirmed that Harold's clothing carried traces from more than one physical struggle before his death. Instead of narrowing the investigation, the report deepened the uncertainty surrounding everyone involved. While detectives reviewed the results, Lena found herself trapped beneath relentless pressure that no amount of silence could escape. Reporters remained outside her house nearly every morning. Online speculation painted her as either a calculating murderer or an innocent young woman manipulated by an older man. Former neighbors crossed the street rather than greet her. Even routine errands became unbearable under whispered conversations and lingering stares. Sleep disappeared. Meals went untouched. She jumped whenever the telephone rang, convinced another accusation waited on the other end. Daniel watched her deteriorate with conflicted emotions. Part of him still loved the woman he had married. Another part could no longer recognize her beneath layers of deception and grief. He had delayed confronting her because he feared the answer more than the suspicion. Now he understood that avoiding the truth had become impossible. One evening he placed his worn notebook on the kitchen table. "We need to talk." Lena looked at it without sitting. "I'm tired. So am I." She slowly lowered herself into the chair. Daniel opened the notebook, revealing pages filled with dates, receipts, and observations. "I never wanted to become this person. You were spying on me. I was trying to understand. You should have trusted me. I tried." His voice trembled. "Every late grocery trip. Every phone call you ended when I walked into the room. Every excuse." He slid the cafe receipt across the table. "You told me you were buying groceries." Lena stared silently. "You were with him." Tears gathered in her eyes. "Say something. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "Did you love him?" The question lingered between them. "I thought I did." "Thought? I don't know anymore." Daniel laughed bitterly. "I spent months believing I was failing you. You weren't. Then why?" He listened. "I would have listened. I stopped believing you could. You never gave me the chance." She covered her face. "I know." He reached into the notebook again. "I found cash deposits." She looked up sharply. "Did he give you money?" "Sometimes." "For what?" "I don't know." "You accepted money from him without asking why." "I convinced myself it didn't matter." Daniel shook his head slowly. "Nothing about this makes sense." "It doesn't to me either." "Tell me about that night." Lena inhaled deeply. "We argued." "Who argued?" "All of us." "What happened after I left?" "I told Harold everything had gone too far." "And?" "He didn't want me to leave." "Did he threaten you?" She hesitated. "He said nobody else would understand me." "That's not an answer." He grabbed my arm. Daniel leaned forward. "What happened next?" I pulled away. "Then what?" "I heard something fall." "What fell?" "I don't know." "You were there." "I was terrified." "Did you see him die?" Her silence filled the room. "Lena." "I ran." "You left him there?" I couldn't think. Daniel closed the notebook. "You're still hiding something." "I'm telling you what I remember." "No." He stood. "You're telling me only what you can live with." His words echoed through the silent kitchen long after he walked outside. Lena remained motionless, struggling to separate memory from guilt. She had confessed the affair, admitted accepting Harold's money, and acknowledged fleeing after the confrontation. Yet one crucial piece of that stormy night remained buried inside her, locked behind fear she still could not overcome. The following morning, Detective Morgan received an unexpected visitor at the station. A young newspaper delivery driver introduced himself nervously. "I didn't think it mattered before," he admitted. "What changed your mind?" Morgan asked. "I saw the news. And I remembered someone else near Harold's house after the shouting stopped." Morgan leaned forward. "You saw another person?" The young man nodded slowly. "I couldn't see the face because of the rain." "What could you see?" A dark figure climbed over the side fence and disappeared before the police ever arrived. The room fell silent. For the first time since Harold's death, investigators had the possibility of a witness whose story introduced someone no one had previously considered. The delivery driver's statement forced investigators to dismantle the timeline they had spent weeks assembling. Detective Morgan ordered every interview reviewed again, every recovered message reread, and every piece of physical evidence compared against the new possibility that someone else had been present after the confrontation. What had appeared to be a closed circle of suspects suddenly widened, and the final hours of Harold's life were reconstructed minute by minute until the missing pieces finally began fitting together. Forensic analysts determined that Harold had not died immediately after the argument. During the struggle on the porch, Lena pulled away as Harold tightened his grip on her arm. Daniel stepped forward, attempting to separate them. Harold lost his balance, striking the stone edge of a garden planter before collapsing onto the wet pathway. The injury left him dazed but still alive. Panicked and soaked by the storm, Daniel believed Harold would recover once he regained consciousness. Lena, overwhelmed by fear and shame, fled without looking back. Daniel followed moments later, convinced the incident had ended. Neither called for help. Neither realized Harold remained critically injured in the relentless rain. The mysterious figure seen climbing the fence turned out to be Harold's estranged nephew, Marcus, who had secretly visited that evening hoping to confront his uncle about unresolved family finances. Embarrassed by years of conflict, Marcus admitted he hid when he heard voices arguing. After everyone left, he approached Harold and found him breathing with difficulty. "Why didn't you call an ambulance?" Detective Morgan asked. Marcus lowered his head. "I thought he'd survive." "You simply walked away?" "He looked at me." "What did he say?" Marcus swallowed hard. "He whispered, 'Leave me.'" "You believed him?" "I believed he didn't want my help." Medical experts later concluded that immediate emergency treatment might have saved Harold's life. Instead, valuable minutes passed while each frightened person convinced themselves someone else would act. His death resulted not from a deliberate killing but from a devastating chain of decisions, hesitation, and emotional paralysis. The law recognized responsibility without proving intentional murder. The prosecutor announced that criminal charges reflecting negligent conduct and obstruction would proceed where supported by evidence, while other allegations remained unprovable beyond reasonable doubt. The courtroom accepted that manipulation, betrayal, and fear had created the circumstances leading to Harold's death. Yet none alone explained the tragedy. Justice arrived imperfectly, acknowledging legal accountability without satisfying anyone's sense of closure. Daniel listened quietly as the judgment was delivered. He had entered the courtroom believing punishment would restore something stolen from him. Instead, he left realizing no verdict could repair the trust destroyed long before the storm. Lena accepted responsibility for the lies that fractured her marriage and for abandoning a wounded man instead of seeking help. She also recognized that Harold's influence had shaped many of her choices without erasing her own free will. Living with that contradiction became a sentence no court could impose or remove. Marcus returned to his family carrying the burden of knowing compassion delayed by bitterness had cost his uncle a final chance at survival. Detective Morgan closed the case with less satisfaction than usual, understanding that solving a crime did not always mean untangling every emotional truth behind it. The neighborhood eventually removed the police tape, repaired broken fences, and resumed familiar routines. Children laughed again where investigators once searched for evidence. Yet every surviving life carried an absence that could never be restored. Harold lost his future. Daniel lost the marriage he believed was secure. Marcus lost the opportunity for reconciliation. And Lena lost both the illusion that love alone could heal loneliness and the ordinary life she would never reclaim. Months passed, and the neighborhood gradually reclaimed its familiar rhythm. Fresh flowers replaced the wilted bouquets once left outside Harold's gate. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks again, and weekend lawn mowers drowned out the whispers that had once followed every passing police car. The yellow tape, camera flashes, and crowded news vans had disappeared, leaving only repaired fences and carefully trimmed hedges to suggest that tragedy had ever visited the quiet street. To an outsider, everything appeared ordinary again. Those who had lived through the investigation knew better. Harold's house remained empty for several months before distant relatives arranged its sale. Workers carried old furniture onto moving trucks, unaware of the memories attached to each worn chair and faded photograph. The porch where countless conversations had begun now stood silent beneath the afternoon sun. Neighbors occasionally glanced toward the property before quickly looking away, as though acknowledging the house for too long might awaken ghosts they preferred to forget. Daniel eventually moved into a smaller apartment across town. The divorce had been finalized quietly, without bitterness inside the courtroom because all the anger had already been exhausted long before legal papers were signed. He rarely spoke about the marriage. Friends noticed he had become more reserved, slower to trust, yet kinder toward people carrying invisible burdens. Pain had not hardened him completely. It had simply taught him that ordinary lives could conceal extraordinary loneliness. Lena chose to remain in the neighborhood for a while despite the uncomfortable memories surrounding every street corner. Leaving immediately felt too much like escaping responsibility. Instead, she accepted the uneasy silence that followed her whenever she entered a grocery store or walked through the local park. Some people still judged her. Others quietly pitied her. Neither reaction changed the truth she carried every day. She often sat alone beside her living room window, staring toward the empty house where Harold had once lived. She no longer searched for excuses or comforting explanations. The affair had not begun because of a single conversation, a single lie, or a single kiss. It had grown through dozens of small decisions that seemed harmless when viewed separately. Every ignored doubt, every hidden message, every postponed conversation with Daniel had quietly built the path leading toward irreversible loss. Sometimes she wondered whether Harold had loved her in his own complicated way. Other times she questioned whether he had simply needed someone who needed him. The answer no longer mattered as much as it once had. She understood that affection could exist beside manipulation, just as guilt could exist beside victimhood. Human choices were rarely as simple as innocence or blame. Detective Morgan closed the official case file, yet its lessons lingered far beyond the paperwork. During training sessions with younger investigators, she occasionally reflected that the most dangerous crimes often began long before any law was broken. Violence was frequently the final chapter, not the opening sentence. In the end, the neighborhood recovered its appearance but never its innocence. The tragedy remained a quiet reminder that broken relationships seldom collapse overnight. They unravel through silence, neglected honesty, and moments dismissed as insignificant until consequences become impossible to reverse. Truth eventually emerged, bringing accountability without peace, explanations without comfort, and justice without celebration. As life moved forward, one unsettling question refused to disappear. If loneliness can quietly reshape ordinary people, then where does responsibility truly begin? And can any confession ever fully repair what silence first destroyed?